imagery, and he was a master at it. But this week, we're not going to talk so much about the 40th president. We're going to talk about the events of the 60s and particularly the 1970s, and how that pretty major social changes happened that greatly helped Reagan. But before we do that, let me remind myself, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that anyone here's got anything in common with the President of the United States not remembering things, but we talked last week about General Electric and its role in Reagan's success, how it resurrected his career. We looked and talked about the speech that many historians think Reagan got his start in politics. And we also examined his election and record as the Governor of California. Now this week we'll continue our journey, but as I said, we'll take a little detour to the 1970s that some of you might remember, and that will help us understand the factors that led to the rise of Reagan and later Trump. Now we'll cover two major contributing factors. First, the downturn of the economy, and third, the upturn of the religious right. But before we get to that, let's take a step further back to the 1960s. And that's when the seeds were sown that started to sprout in the 1970s. The 1970s were influenced by many events of the previous decade, but for our purposes, we'll look at three that I think had a major impact. First, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And here's Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic Party president, shaking hands with Martin Luther King. That was a great moment. They were great pieces of legislation, and the current Supreme Court is doing a good job of undoing the Voting Rights Act at the moment. So these acts, both these acts, caused a shudder throughout the white South, especially among white and middle-class voters who felt that their values, the values that they held dear, were slipping away. Their future looked uncertain. Now, the third event was the Vietnam War. One of Richard Nixon's 1968 election promises was to bring peace, but a year after the election, peace was as elusive as ever. Now, that was an enormous blow to the pride of the United States. The United States was instrumental in the Allies winning the Second World War. But here it was, it couldn't win a war against a far less formidable enemy in the jungles of Vietnam. Come on, what's going on? In November 1969, Nixon had been in office almost a year when he addressed the nation about the war. Towards the end of the address, he said, "And so tonight to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support." Now, he's referring to the majority of people who don't loudly express their political and social views, but can affect the results of elections. It's implicit that the loud anti-Vietnam War protesters weren't the only people with opinions. The silent majority weren't those long-haired louts yelling in the streets. The silent majority were good, God-fearing white men and women going about their business, raising their nuclear family on Main Street, paying their mortgages and taxes. And although they don't broadcast their opinions as loudly as the Liberal left and the long-haired, drug-smoking louts on the university campuses, they deserve to be heard. And President Nixon's listening, and he understands. In more recent years, the daughters and sons of the silent majority in 1969 have become disillusioned, disenfranchised, and despondent because they feel the American dream has not delivered for them. They want to know, where's their share? They were the people who helped elect Ronald Reagan in 1980, and Reagan, by his actions and policies, created more of them. But before we get to know how that happened, we need to understand how Nixon prepared the groundwork for Reagan. Now, there's a political scandal that's synonymous with the 1970s, isn't there? Isn't there? What is it? That's right. Watergate. So distrust, disrespect and disillusion with government didn't begin with the exposure of the break-in into the Watergate apartment building. But the cover-up and aftermath was a big contributor. Now, we don't need to go into the details of what happened because I'm sure you're aware, but what happened was that Nixon dealt a blow to US democracy by raising doubts about honesty, trust and integrity in government. And it didn't disappear with the departure of Nixon. Those doubts got steadily worse. And worse since then, and those doubts have been deepened and aided and abetted by Nixon's successors. If we think about the behaviour of some presidents, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, for example. So all these little things chip away at the edifice of democracy. So there were three factors in the 1970s that helped bring Reagan to office, and they had long-lasting consequences that we're still feeling today. First was the economic downturn. Now, the perceived decline in American prestige in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and also Watergate. And on top of that, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan and the Iran hostage crisis. So those factors all dealt a blow to American prestige. The third factor that brought votes to Reagan was the upturn in the religious right. Now, the economic downturn was a big shock to Americans. Since the end of the war, the Second World War, they had become accustomed to every year being a boom year, to every generation doing better than the previous generation. In the 50s and 60s, average economic growth was 4.5% a year. Inflation was about 3% a year. And personal income tax and company tax and other taxes were a lot higher than they are today. These were high taxing times, and these were the results. So between 1945 and 1973, ordinary Americans' real incomes doubled. As one writer put it, a high school dropout who had grown up with an outhouse could retire with a vacation house. But all that changed from 1970 to 1978, when economic growth averaged less than 3% a year, and inflation was an average 10% a year. The price of food was rising at 16% a year. So Americans, for the first time since 1945, started to believe they lived in an era of scarcity. They weren't used to it, and they didn't like it. And the cause was this: the price of oil. There were two oil crises in the 1970s. The first was in 1973, and the second was in 1979. Now, the crude oil price in January 1979 was $66.75 a barrel. But just 2 months later, it was $145.65. Now, because oil is such an economic fundamental that affects almost every part of life in modern Western society, from food production to manufacturing, the 120% price increase in oil at the beginning of 1979 had a devastating impact on the US economy. And that impact was exacerbated by people hoarding oil. And of course, that helped push the price up as well. Now, the reason for this enormous price hike was the revolution in Iran in January 1979, when Islamic fundamentalists overthrew the government and Iranian oil output fell by nearly 5 million barrels a day. That's 7% of world production at the time. Now, that sudden fall in supply created havoc. In the United States, people had to queue for petrol. They had to pay a record price for it at the bowser, that is, if there was any left. They feared more cuts to the oil supply, as I said, and so they hoarded oil, which of course exacerbated what was already a dire situation. The second factor that helped bring Reagan to office was the rise of the religious right. So in September 1972, you might be shocked by what's to come. In September 1972, what might have been the first Christian activist group was formed. And this group wasn't connected to the Republican Party. It wasn't within the Republican Party. It didn't have anything to do with the Republican Party. This organisation was called Evangelicals for McGovern. McGovern was George McGovern, the Democratic Party candidate for president in 1972. George McGovern had strong Christian religious links. He had been a seminary student, and his father was a Methodist church minister. One editor of a Christian publication lauded McGovern as a first ray of hope in the midst of widespread despair. So now let's have a look at the policies Evangelicals for McGovern wanted. They supported withdrawal from Vietnam. They wanted a 37% reduction in defence spending. They wanted the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. The platform that George McGovern put to the American people was the most liberal ever and included these things. Evangelical support wasn't enough, though, to get McGovern elected. Nixon won in a massive landslide, and this is what the electoral map looked like. McGovern won only the District of Columbia and the state of Maryland. He didn't even win his own state of South Dakota. Now, you can understand that the Democrats were bereft. They were extremely disappointed. Now, before we go on, for those of you that have been to other presentations that I've given, you'll know that I like to define what we're talking about, especially when we're talking about particular words. You know how we've talked about elites in the past and what they really mean? Well, let's have a look at what an evangelical is. The religious author and Jimmy Carter biographer Randall Balmer writes that an evangelical believes conversion is central to Christianity, and that assertion is based on a mention in the New Testament that refers to being born again. Conversion is turning away from sin to embrace salvation. An evangelical is committed to converting others. Now, let's get back to the 1972 election aftermath. A few weeks after the election, evangelicals met in Chicago, and they approved the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. Now, the declaration included that God requires justice, but we have not proclaimed or demonstrated his justice to an unjust American society. Although the Lord calls us to defend the social and economic rights of the poor and oppressed, we have remained mostly silent. The Declaration condemned evangelical complicity in racism and the nation's reliance on militarism. It called attention to the problem of hunger and attacked the materialism of US culture and the maldistribution of the country's wealth and services. So this is socialist stuff by today's terms, isn't it? This is extreme, radical, left-wing stuff that has no place in US politics. But here are evangelical Christians proclaiming it, agitating for it and wanting it. So the Declaration also said, we acknowledge that we have encouraged men to prideful domination and women to irresponsible passivity. So we call both men and women to mutual submission and active discipleship. Now, there was a Democratic Party member who agreed with all of that. He was a less conventional candidate, but he was someone the Democrats thought could be their salvation in 1976. Jimmy Carter. He had been elected governor of Georgia, in 1970, and he'd been noticed by party leaders who asked him to head the Democratic Party's Congressional Campaign Committee. Now, that role required him to travel throughout the country, which enabled him to introduce himself to voters and Democratic Party office holders and other decision makers. He announced his candidature for president on the 12th of December 1974. The second sentence of his speech was, I am a farmer, an engineer, a businessman, a planner, a scientist, a governor, and a Christian. He said it was time to reaffirm and strengthen our ethical and spiritual, political beliefs. He referred to worship and quoted the Bible. Later in the campaign, he talked about how he had been born again. Now, this is not to say that Carter made his Christianity the centre of his campaign. He didn't. His pitch was that he could restore trust in government, he would work for human rights at home and abroad, and provide better health care, as well as a fairer tax system and equality of opportunity. He cultivated an image of being squeaky clean. He said, I'll never tell a lie. I'll never make a misleading statement. I'll never betray the confidence that any of you had in me, and I'll never avoid a controversial issue. I don't think he kept all those promises, but I do think that he never avoided a controversial issue to his detriment. Now, voting, as we know, isn't compulsory in the United States, which means the major task of the two parties, political parties at elections, is to motivate their supporters to vote. In 1976, Jimmy Carter's earnest, honest, and the wearing of his Christian faith heart on his sleeve motivated not just Democrats, but Republicans to vote for him. Voters were weary of the dishonest, duplicitous, and deplorable Nixon administration. They liked Carter's compassionate message of honesty, of support of women's rights, and racial reconciliation. Carter's term started with much promise. Americans knew they were in for something different when he eschewed the motorcade down Pennsylvania Avenue and walked with his wife Rosalind and daughter Amy. Success in politics requires luck. As a candidate, Jimmy Carter had a lot of it. As president, not so much. Sure, he made decisions that were to his detriment, but he was also blamed for events over which he had no control. Right-wing Christians, along with many other Americans, were not happy with Carter's leadership. During his term, 1977 to 1981, the religious right fought back. They fought hard and they fought effectively. Randall Balmer says, Paul Weyrich, a conservative strategist, was the principal architect of the religious right. He was born in Wisconsin in 1942. He became a journalist and later a political staffer for right-wing politicians. He was instrumental in setting up 3 think tanks, Australian equivalents of the right-wing Sydney Institute and the Progressive Australia Institute, among others. Weyrich's institutes each had a different remit, but all had the goal to propagate an extreme right-wing agenda that was cloaked in academic finery. When Reagan came to office in January 1981, these 3 organisations capitalised on the right-wing wave to reshape American politics. These think tanks have become more powerful since they were founded. They have produced, and we talked about this, didn't we? Remember this in the second week? A 900-plus page document that's the blueprint for Trump's next term. So just like another aspiring dictator's manifesto, Project 25 has all the things that Trump wants to achieve there. Public servants' loyalty to the president, not the government or the country. Extensive powers for the president to hire and fire. Denial of the climate catastrophe and a rollback of policies President Biden has implemented. Project 25 is a warning, just like Mein Kampf was a warning. History has many lessons to teach us. The problem is we don't listen. Now let's get back to where we were. Weyrich made that agenda clear, that religious right agenda, when he was asked what made the new right different. He said the new right weren't really conservatives. Now you might have heard me say that before. It annoys me, and people close to me keep calling these people conservatives. They're not. These people are, well, let's see what Paul Weyrich says about them. He says the new right weren't really conservatives. They were radicals working to overturn the present power structure in this country. That are the exact words that you would expect a left-winger, a socialist or a communist to say. And this is out of the mouth of a so-called conservative. The new political philosophy must be defined by us in moral terms, packaged in non-religious language and propagated throughout the country by our new coalition. When political power is achieved, the moral majority will have the opportunity to recreate this great nation. And that is exactly what they're doing now. Weyrich's words aren't those of a conservative, as I said. Weyrich identified abortion as an issue that would motivate Christians. He'd worked for years to politicise Christians. By the mid-1970s, he decided a 2-pronged approach was needed. And that was the enlistment of evangelical and fundamentalist leaders that would encourage others to follow them. The second prong was an issue that would anger and unite Christians. He found that issue in a District of Columbia court ruling. And the court ruling was called Green versus Connolly, and it happened in June 1971. The District Court ruled that private schools that radically discriminated should be taxed. They would not be entitled to a federal tax exemption for charitable educational institutions. People who donated to those institutions were no longer entitled to tax deductions. Weyrich knew evangelical institutions, discriminatory or not, would not like this government intrusion into their affairs. Now, one of the jobs of government is to raise money to pay for services for society. That's how it works. Now, these institutions made much of not accepting any money from the federal government, and so they argued the government could not tell them what to do. The government could not tell them who to accept or reject, who to hire or who to fire. But the tax exemption was a public subsidy funded by taxpayers. So sure, they didn't take money from the government directly, but they did indirectly. One of the educational institutions that made the most noise was the Bob Jones University. Don't you love that name? So despite the court ruling, Bob Jones maintained its ban on admitting unmarried African Americans, and it continued its ban of interracial dating, for which offenders would be expelled. Students who espouse, promote or encourage others to violate the university's dating rules and regulations will be expelled. The International Revenue Service, the IRS, investigated Bob Jones University, and in 1976 it revoked the university's tax exemption. To retain it, the university sued. Weyrich claimed the issue was one of religious freedom, not racial discrimination. Other leaders, especially those whose schools were affected by the ruling, claimed the decision was government interference in religious matters. Weyrich used Green versus Connolly to rally evangelicals to unite against the government. He said Green versus Connolly did more than any single act to bring the fundamentalists and the evangelicals into the political process. The IRS Commissioner proposed in August 1978 that educational institutions fulfil a quota of minority students or certify that they had operated in good faith on a racially non-discriminatory basis. The regulations effectively move the burden of proof from the IRS to educational institutions. Now, the American Conservative Union was quick to interpret this as the IRS saying guilty until proven innocent. Evangelicals piled on, saying their schools weren't racially discriminatory and they didn't like being put in a position of being considered guilty until proven innocent. The IRS received 125,000 letters protesting about this new regulation. Weyrich got the issue he wanted, to invoke anger and resentment. Now he needed someone to direct that anger and resentment at. He looked for someone to blame. President Carter. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that President Carter or anyone in his administration had anything to do with the IRS decision or anything that had preceded it. Nothing. The religious right claimed the government was trying to control private schools, that the days of being a Christian free to go about her or his business were over. The televangelist Jerry Falwell complained In some states, it is easier to open a massage parlour than to open the doors of a Christian school. Now let's have a look at the human rights issue the religious right have turned into a moral one. In the mid-1970s, evangelicals and other Christians were not concerned about abortion. No. Abortion was not an issue. They believed that women should have the right to abort a pregnancy. And yes, it's the opposite to what they think now. The first and second testaments of the Bible do not mention abortion. How Christians moved from being pro-abortion to anti is an unequalled propaganda victory of the religious right. As is often the case in changing public opinion, movies played an instrumental part. This is Francis A. Schaeffer. He was a philosopher and a Presbyterian minister. He and his wife, Edith, managed a community and study centre in Switzerland that became a magnet for disaffected and intellectually curious evangelicals. From the mid-1970s, Schaeffer condemned what he called the increasing secular humanism in the United States. I thought the United States was a secular humanist country, but anyway. He lamented the loss of Christian consensus and claimed, shock horror, the US was a secularised society. Schaeffer claimed a consequence of this troubling godlessness was abortion. He claimed it was the inevitable prelude to infanticide and euthanasia. In 1979, Schaeffer and a paediatric surgeon made a series of 5 films directed by Schaeffer's son Frank. They were called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. A scene in the first episode showed the Dead Sea, with hundreds of plastic dolls strewn across the shore. The narrator said they were the untold number of aborted fetuses since the Roe versus Wade ruling in January 1973. The narrator looked earnestly into the camera and decried abortion as an abomination, the slaughter of the innocents. The films were shown in cinemas, and so they reached a much bigger audience than they would have had they been restricted to Christian communities. The films legitimised evangelical political activism to try to turn back the secular tide, and it made abortion a moral issue. By the end of the film's cinema season, Frank Schaeffer recalled, "We were calling for civil disobedience, the takeover of the Republican Party, and even hinting at overthrowing our unjust pro-abortion government." Again, these are not the words of a conservative. The religious right deemed President Carter had not done enough to reduce abortions. But throughout his term in office, the president had tried to limit them by simplifying adoption procedures, advocating sex education, and reducing the stigma of unwanted pregnancies. Whatever the other arguments for or against Jimmy Carter's re-election, the religious right thought his refusal to seek a constitutional amendment to outlaw abortion made him unworthy of support. This was the start of the trend to vote for or against someone on one single issue. An example of this thinking is exemplified by a pastor from Greenbelt, Maryland. His name was Dallas E. Pulliam, and he wrote to the president, "In light of your increasing stand for gays and the stand of the Democratic Party platform for the Equal Rights Amendment, gay rights and pro-abortion, I cannot support you or in good conscience ask others to. As a Southern Baptist pastor, I voted for you in 1976, but this will not be the case this year. Pastor Pulliam's letter is exemplary of tens of thousands of similar letters the White House received. The religious right was succeeding in getting its message across. President Carter supported Roe versus Wade. This is a really crucial, important point. He supported the US Supreme Court's decision. He did not personally support abortion. He understood his role. He said, I need to be cautious about what I say and what I think so that it will be compatible with my own faith and the principles of our country. The religious right were media savvy. By the late 1970s, they had taken over religious television and radio stations. Preachers known as tele-evangelicals, Oral Roberts, Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart, among others, seemed to be everywhere. They talked about America's moral crisis and the need for righteous leadership. I think we might have even had the pleasure of their company on Australian television screens. Jerry Falwell was one who pulled no political punches. He said he would mobilise Conservative voters, educate them about issues and get them to the polls. He told a group of 200 evangelical and fundamentalist ministers in January 1980, which was a presidential election year as we know, he told them, "We are the largest minority bloc in the United States." As well as being media savvy, the religious right were, and still are, rich. At the beginning of 1980, the New York Times estimated that 1 in 5 Americans watched a televangelist at least once a week. And of course, these televangelists weren't shy about asking for donations. I mean, giving money is what God wants. So millions of dollars, tens of millions, hundreds of millions were donated, which helped these organisations establish mechanisms to get people registered and to promote their cause. According to the Los Angeles Times, Oral Roberts had $60 million donated to him in 1978, and other top raters weren't far behind. Now, much of this money, though, went to financing a luxurious lifestyle for these tele-evangelical ministers who got around in helicopters, limousines, lived in enormous houses and had servants. But maybe that was God's will as well. So the religious rights agenda was helped by directly influencing politicians, effectively buying their influence. One of Watergate's legacies were tough laws intended to limit political fundraising. But there was a loophole: political action committees. These organisations could spend as much as they wanted on candidates as long as they didn't coordinate with the candidate. And of course, they'd never do that, would they? The National Conservative Action Committee was a super PAC. It provided candidates with what parties had: media support, voter surveys and advertising consultants, campaign and financial management. The Republican Party's constitution required it to help all Republicans, whether from the religious right or not. But the National Conservative Political Action Committee, being a super PAC, could pick and choose who it supported. And it made sure only the ideologically pure were helped. These are the same people who would complain about communism's ideological purity. So, This gave these super PACs, and especially this National Conservative Political Action Committee, a lot of power. And it's likely that candidates who weren't ardent evangelicals, it's likely that they could have suddenly had a change of heart to get the help they needed. Maybe Jesus or God or someone came and spoke to them. Another milestone in the march of the religious right, of religions, I'll start that again. Another milestone in the march of religious people's march from left to right was an organisation called the Moral Majority. You might have heard of these people. It was co-founded in 1979 by our friend Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell. Falwell wasn't always a preacher politician. In 1965 he published a sermon that attacked Reverend Martin Luther King, in which he wrote, "Preachers are called to be soul winners, not politicians." But 11 years later, he had changed his opinion. This idea of religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country. That year, he held a series of I Love America rallies in 141 cities. He insisted to journalists the rallies were not political. The religious winds of change were blowing. A range of books started to be published with titles such as How to Establish and Operate a Successful Christian School. Another one was A Guide to the Christian School. An Arizona Congress member, John Conlon, co-founded the Christian Freedom Foundation and the Third Century Press, which published books that included One Nation Under God, in which the author claimed the Constitution was designed to perpetuate a Christian order. If one of America's founders and contributors to the writing of the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, was around, I think he would have been surprised to hear that. One of the membership benefits of joining the Freedom Foundation was a copy of the book and another by the same author, The 5 Duties of a Christian Citizen, and a manual about how to elect real Christians to office. The religious rights campaign wasn't limited to the passive. In 1974, a group of fundamentalist Christians in West Virginia objected to the use in schools of textbooks they considered ungodly. Protests escalated to the point of the school building being bombed. Yes, they used dynamite to make their point. The alleged bombers were represented by lawyers engaged by the right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation has been key to the 2025 agenda. The Heritage Foundation, also connected the protest organisers to like-minded anti-textbook supporters throughout the country. One New Right organiser said, "We organise discontent." And that meant looking for issues that roused otherwise apathetic people to right-wing political action. One of those issues was people's sexual orientation. In 1977, the leader of a coalition, Save Our Children, Anita Bryant, yeah, I agree, she led a highly publicised campaign to repeal a local government ordinance, that's a bylaw, or what we would call a bylaw, in Florida. And that bylaw banned discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. The former Miss Oklahoma and runner-up Miss America argued that homosexuality was a sin and homosexuals were child molesters who would recruit children. She said, "As a mother, I know that homosexuals cannot biologically reproduce children." Oh, she's bright, isn't she? Therefore, they must recruit our children. Horrific, isn't she? If gays are granted rights, next we'll have to give rights to prostitutes and to people who sleep with St Bernards and to nail biters. And I might say there was a former editor of one of the Murdoch papers, it might have been the Daily Telegraph, Piers Ackerman, who on Insiders, when talking about marriage equality, he said the next thing we'll have is laws so people can marry their pets. So, the Anti-Discrimination Ordinance was repealed after what we would call a plebiscite. 69% of voters supported the repeal. Well, there are battles and wars, and Anita Bryant won that battle, but she ignited the gay community into action. Bryant was the spokesperson for the Florida Citrus Commission, and the tagline of one of the Commission's advertisements was, "Breakfast without orange juice is like a day without sunshine." That's quite catchy, isn't it? The newly formed Coalition for Human Rights and the Miami Victory Campaign organised a national boycott of oranges, and they produced merchandise that promoted the slogan, "A day without human rights is like a day without sunshine." Anita Bryant was sacked by the Citrus Commission. She went bankrupt and her marriage failed. But in 1978, at the time of the Florida appeal, the new right was on the way up. Along with the formation of extreme right think tanks, in the 1978 midterm elections, evangelicals were elected to the Senate from 3 states. At the same time, radical right activist Phyllis Schlafly, and I know time's getting on, but I do have to tell you, there's a movie, it probably still is on Netflix or one of those providers, called Mrs. America. It is brilliant. Cate Blanchett plays Phyllis Schlafly, and she's absolutely superb. It's called Mrs. America. So Phyllis Schlafly was loudly opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. Now, the ERA would enshrine in the Constitution equal rights for both sexes. Now, the first version of the ERA, wait for it, was introduced in Congress in 1923. And it passed both houses. Constitutional change in the United States requires 2/3 of the House of Representatives and Senate to support it, and then the next step after congressional approval is ratification by 3/4 of the states' legislatures. So that's 38 states have to approve it for it to become part of the Constitution. In 1972, March 1972, the ERA was put to the states with a 7-year deadline for ratification. Most states did it within a year. Schlafly headed the Stop ERA campaign. Stop was an acronym for Stop Taking Our Privileges. The campaign is another example of the extreme right's adeptness at turning blatant lies into an effective political campaign. Contrary to taking privileges, the ERA would have provided them. Schlafly, a mother of 6, of course, believed a woman's place was in the home, but she spent a lot of time out of hers. She used her organisational skills to arrange a well-attended conference in Houston in 1977, the pro-life, pro-family rally. Historian Rick Perlstein wrote, "It was easier to recruit the reluctant into a political crusade when that crusade was winning." The walls were tumbling down, and over the next 7 headlong months, the modern Christian right was born. and it grew fast. By 1981, another religious right organisation, Christian Voice, had the 8th biggest political action committee in the country. Jimmy Carter's pollster could see the threat the new right was to Democrats. Voters were showing that they feared change in society more than losing their place in the middle class, and that had not happened before. The ERA amendment wasn't ratified, and today its approval looks far more unattainable than it was 50 years ago. When Shafley started her campaign in 1972, 28 of the required 38 legislatures had ratified. By the time of the deadline, only 3 states had not ratified. According to a political scientist, it was because of Phyllis Shafley. The amendment would have been ratified by 1975 or 1976 had it not been for Phyllis Shafley's early and effective effort to organise political opponents. The religious right agenda was, and still is, not just opposed to equal rights for women, but also it's anti-abortion, it's anti-gay, it's anti-government. And if you're thinking these people are anti-everything, they're not. They are for some things. They are for pro-Christian nationalism. They believe the United States was founded as a white Christian nation and there is no separation between church and state. Never mind the people who were there before the white people came. Pro-gun ownership, and they are pro-Christian prayers in all schools. Bad luck if you're another religion. If you don't fit in, you can nick off. Now, let's remind ourselves quickly about what we've talked about this week. We began with the 1970s that helped us understand the factors that led to the rise of Reagan and later Trump. We covered 2 major contributing factors to that, the downturn of the economy and the upturn of the religious right. Next time we meet, which I'm looking forward to, we'll talk about the 1976 election, Reagan's unprecedented challenge to an incumbent president, Gerald Ford, for the Republican Party nomination, and we'll talk about Jimmy Carter's unprecedented rise, and you'll see how he came from nowhere to win the White House. We've got about a minute for a question. Does anyone have a question, or are we all going to depart? Maybe we're all going to depart. Thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next week. There we are, sir. Thanks very much.
I think that iconic photo you've got,
Yeah.
that is,